You really thought you were going to get the house, didn't you, Michael? God, you've always been so naive. My brother's voice cut through the quiet hum of chatter in the corner booth at the Waffle House on Route 42. The kind of place where every set of eyes turns toward the sound of raised voices without actually turning their heads, and I could feel the weight of strangers' curiosity pressing against my skin like a heat lamp. His smirk was wide enough for the waitress pouring coffee 2 tables over to catch it in the reflection of the chrome napkin holder. And my mother, sitting beside him with that tight little smile she wore whenever she thought she'd just scored some private victory, reached across the table to touch his wrist, as if they were sealing some unspoken alliance. My fork hung in the air halfway to my mouth, a cooling bite of scrambled eggs wobbling at the end, and all I could do was study the syrup stains on the laminated menu in front of me while my mind scrambled to keep pace with the reality of what I just heard. The quiet clink of silverware from other tables sounded unnaturally loud, like the whole diner had decided to pretend to eat while secretly feeding off the awkwardness bleeding from our booth. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I'm Michael Harrington, 41 years old, born and raised right here in Franklin, Ohio. The kind of small town that smells like cut grass in the summer and wet leaves in the fall, where Main Street still has a hardware store with a squeaky front door and a movie theater with a flickering marquee that's been spelling half the titles wrong for as long as I can remember. I've spent the last 2 decades working my way out of the debt I inherited when my father's contracting business went belly up in '05, starting with the night shift stocking shelves at Kroger before climbing into sales, then operations, and finally, after years of swallowing my pride and working weekends nobody else wanted, landing a regional director role with a logistics company that paid me more than I'd ever dreamed I'd make. It wasn't luck. It was years of missing birthdays, Christmases, and 4th of July barbecues so I could pay off their mortgage, fix their cars, and send them on anniversary trips they couldn't afford. And the house, the old 2-story Craftsman on Sycamore Street with the white porch swing and the stubborn screen door that never quite latched. I kept that house standing, kept the roof from caving in, the furnace from dying, the taxes from swallowing it whole. I thought we were all on the same side. I thought I knew what loyalty bought you. That morning, as my brother sipped his coffee like it was the punchline to some joke only he and my parents were in on, I knew I had been wrong. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with a pencil stuck behind her ear, slid a plate of hash browns in front of me without making eye contact, but her glance lingered just long enough for me to know she'd caught every word. My mother cleared her throat and said, "Your father and I just thought it made sense. You don't even live here anymore, and Danny's been around to help with things." The words stung, not because they were true, they weren't, but because they were delivered in that soft, measured voice she used when she thought she was being reasonable, the same tone she'd used when explaining why they couldn't co-sign my first car loan, because money's tight right now, even though I later found out they'd lent Danny $2,000 the same week. Somewhere deep down, under the shock and the bitterness, a colder thought flickered, a reminder that I had one thing they didn't know about, one thing they couldn't take from me no matter how many signatures they scribbled on some lawyer's will. It wasn't time to think about it yet, but it sat there in my mind like a locked drawer I had the only key to. Outside the Waffle House window, I could see the morning sun glinting off the frost, still clinging to the hoods of pickup trucks in the parking lot, the air sharp with that late winter bite that makes your breath curl like smoke. Franklin in February is a place where life moves slow, where people still nod when they pass you on the sidewalk, and gossip takes less than a day to travel from one end of town to the other. Which meant that by dinner time, everyone from the high school football coach to the lady who runs the laundromat would know that Michael Harrington, the one who made it and took care of his folks, had been cut out in favor of Danny, who'd barely worked a full-time job in his life and still called mom when his light bill was due. I set my fork down and just looked at them, my parents and my brother, all three of them with that faint glimmer of smugness you can't fake, the kind that comes from believing the game is already over and you've already won. In that moment, the image of the house flashed in my mind. Not the way it looked now, but the way it looked when I was 10, with my father's tools scattered in the garage and the kitchen smelling like my grandmother's peach cobbler, the one she always baked in that chipped blue ceramic dish I'd eventually rescued from a box in the attic when they tried to throw it away after she died. That dish was the last thing I had from her, and I'd kept it with me through every move, every apartment, every house I'd bought since. Sitting there, I realized it wasn't just a piece of kitchenware. It was the one constant in a life where everything else seemed negotiable. I didn't know how yet, but I knew that dish would be there at the end of this when everything settled, and the people who thought they'd beaten me were standing in the rubble of their own choices. My brother reached for the check and said, "Don't worry, I've got this one." Like paying for my $10 breakfast would erase the 30 years I'd spent keeping the lights on in that house. My father just nodded, eyes on his coffee, silent in the way he'd been silent every time something mattered. I stood, slipped my jacket on, and stepped out into the cold air, my breath clouding in front of me as the bell over the Waffle House door jingled behind me. I could feel the stairs through the glass, could almost hear the murmurs starting before I'd even reached my truck. The key was cold in my hand, and as the engine turned over, I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell or plead or try to reason with them. I was going to take that locked drawer in my mind, the one holding my secret, and I was going to open it. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And when I did, they'd understand exactly what it cost to mistake my silence for surrender. The thing about Franklin is that news doesn't just travel, it mutates, twisting into sharper shapes as it bounces from one front porch to the next. And by the end of that first week after the Waffle House ambush, I could feel the shift in how people looked at me in the grocery store, like I was a man who'd been quietly knocked off his pedestal without even knowing it. I caught the high school principal, Mr. Garner, standing by the frozen food section with a bag of peas in his hand, giving me a tight little smile that carried the unmistakable pity reserved for someone who's just been made the butt of a small-town joke, and though he didn't say it out loud, I could almost hear the words he wasn't speaking. He took care of them all these years, and look how they paid him back. My brother Danny, meanwhile, had taken to parking Dad's old Chevy Silverado right out front of Murphy's grocery, just so folks could see him loading up the bed with bags he'd picked up from Mom and Dad, playing the role of the dutiful son like it was some kind of community theater production. My parents, for their part, leaned into it. I heard from Mrs. Kaplan at the bank that my mother had been telling anyone who'd listen about how Danny was always around to help, and how it was only natural that the house should stay with the child who still lives nearby. The words had a way of finding me, even when I wasn't looking for them, slipping through conversations, dropped casually in the way people talk about the weather or road construction on Route 73, and each time they lodged somewhere deeper under my skin. I didn't bite back, though. I didn't correct the record or tell anyone about the checks I'd sent over the years, or the nights I'd driven down from Cincinnati in the middle of a snowstorm because the furnace had gone out again, or the thousands I'd put into a new roof when the insurance adjuster tried to lowball them. That wasn't the play. The play was patience. Because here's the thing they didn't know, here's the thing no one in Franklin knew. The house might have been in their name, but the land beneath it, the actual dirt it sat on, was a different story entirely. Years ago, back when my father was drowning in debt and the bank was licking its chops, I'd quietly bought the lot from the county for back taxes in a side deal that never made its way into the small-town rumor mill, keeping it in a trust under a name no one would recognize. They'd assumed, as people do, that owning the house meant owning the ground it stood on. They'd assumed wrong. But that was my locked drawer, and I wasn't about to open it yet. Instead, I played along. I came down on Sundays like nothing had changed, mowing the lawn or changing out the filter in the air handler, nodding politely when Danny strutted around giving updates on the house repairs he'd supposedly done. "Got the porch step fixed," he'd say, pointing to a new plank of wood I'd bought and installed myself 2 months earlier. Mom would beam at him like he built the damn place from the ground up, and I'd just smile and sip my coffee, watching the two of them spin their little narrative tighter and tighter, not realizing they were wrapping it around their own necks. Franklin in March is all mud and wind, the kind that whips through your coat and smells faintly of thawing earth, and the town's rhythms slow down until Easter rolls around. People get restless. They look for stories. So when Danny started talking about renovating the upstairs and turning the place into something special, the rumor mill kicked into overdrive. I heard talk at the VFW about him wanting to open a bed and breakfast to honor Mom and Dad's legacy, and my mother ate it up like it was scripture, telling anyone who'd listen about her vision for the place. That's when I started planting my seeds. A quiet word with the zoning commissioner about property lines. A casual coffee with old man Whitaker, who'd been on the county planning board since the Reagan years and still thought of me as the kid who helped him dig his truck out of a snowbank back in '94. I never mentioned the trust. I never mentioned my ownership. I just asked about hypotheticals. What happens when a property straddles two parcels? What permits are needed for structural changes? How long it takes to clear a title dispute? All under the radar, all wrapped in friendly small talk. At the same time, I let Danny think he was winning. I even slipped him a couple of my contractor contacts, in case you meet someone for that upstairs work, watching as he swaggered into deals he couldn't possibly afford to finish. My father stayed quiet through all of it, sitting in his recliner with the TV turned up too loud, eyes flicking between me and Danny like he was watching a slow-motion car wreck but couldn't decide which driver to root for. There were moments, small ones, when I wondered if he felt the edge of the blade they'd handed me without knowing it, but if he did, he never let on. Instead, he let Mom run the show, and she reveled in it, in the attention, in the way people leaned in when she talked about our Danny, in the subtle digs she got to slip in about how some folks just move away and forget where they came from. Each one was a spark on dry grass, and I could feel the fire building, waiting for the right wind. Meanwhile, I kept that chipped blue ceramic dish in my own kitchen, up on the top shelf where I could see it every morning when I made coffee, a reminder that not everything they thought they owned was truly theirs. The weeks slid by, April warming the air, the scent of blooming lilacs drifting through town, and with it came Danny's big announcement. He'd secured a private loan to fund the renovations, was hiring crews to start transforming the house into a destination. He made the announcement in the middle of church coffee hour, standing next to my mother like a politician at a campaign stop, and the applause was polite but real. I clapped too, because why not? Let him build his castle on sand. Every nail he drove, every dollar he borrowed, every promise he made, all of it tightened the noose. And as I shook his hand afterward, feeling the smug grip of a man who thought he'd outplayed me, I couldn't help but smile, because I knew something he didn't. That locked drawer in my mind was starting to rattle, and soon enough, I was going to open it. By the middle of May, the old Harrington place on Sycamore Street had become a construction zone, the quiet of the neighborhood broken each morning by the grind of circular saws and the thud of hammers echoing off the walls that had once held our family dinners and birthday parties. And I'd drive by on my way into town just to watch Danny pacing the porch with a cell phone pressed to his ear, barking orders to contractors like he was some seasoned developer instead of a man stringing himself along on borrowed money. The upstairs windows were boarded up, the front yard torn to mud by the weight of delivery trucks hauling in drywall and lumber, and every time I caught sight of it, I felt the knot in my chest tighten, not with regret, but with the anticipation of a fisherman watching a hook trout tire itself out. Franklin in late spring is a riot of green. The sidewalks littered with pink petals from the dogwoods, but around that house it looked like a war zone, and the neighbors were already grumbling about the noise, the mess, and the trucks blocking their driveways. I didn't join the chorus. I just smiled and nodded when they complained, knowing full well that the mess was part of the music I'd been conducting since February. I'd begun the next phase of my plan in earnest, quietly securing documentation from the county that confirmed the parcel ownership, renewing the trust paperwork, and making sure the paper trail was airtight. I even had a quiet conversation with an attorney in Cincinnati who specialized in property disputes, framing it as a hypothetical involving a family matter, while he assured me that in the event of any legal challenge, the landowner, me, would hold the trump card. Meanwhile, Danny's mouth kept running faster than his brain. He started posting progress photos on Facebook, showing off the vision for the place. White shiplap walls, restored hardwood floors, a clawfoot tub in the upstairs bath, all captioned with lines like, "Can't wait to share this with our first guests this fall," and "Building a legacy, one nail at a time." The comments were full of encouragement, but I noticed the same names popping up again and again. People he owed money to, people who'd loaned him tools, people who were expecting payment for work as soon as the loan clears. The ticking clock wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in his life, counting down the days until someone knocked on the door asking where their check was. I kept feeding the countdown. A small, anonymous tip to the zoning board about possible code violations. A casual mention to a mutual friend that Danny might be planning to rent out rooms without proper licensing. Little things, just enough to spark official curiosity. By early June, the first letter from the county arrived at the house. I know because I was parked across the street when the mailman handed it to my mother, and I saw her stand there in the doorway reading it, her brow furrowing before she called for Danny. He waved it off, of course, but I could see the tension in the way his shoulders squared as he stuffed it into his back pocket. That weekend, I came by under the guise of helping with yard work and saw the upstairs gutted down to the studs, wires hanging from the ceiling, and a half-finished bathroom with pipes jutting like broken bones. "Looking good," I said, running a hand along the bare framing, and he grinned like a man convinced he was on the brink of greatness. "Couple more weeks, we'll be ready for paint," he said, and I nodded, not bothering to point out that the bank clock on his loan was running faster than the contractor's clock on his work. The symbolic weight of that chipped blue ceramic dish had been growing heavier in my mind, and one night, standing in my kitchen, I took it down from the shelf and ran my fingers along the hairline cracks, remembering the way my grandmother used to pull it from the oven with mitts worn thin at the fingertips, the smell of peaches and sugar filling the air. It wasn't just an heirloom, it was proof of what mattered, of who'd built something real in this family, and I knew exactly how it would make its return when the time came. By the end of June, the weather had turned heavy with the kind of humidity that makes the air feel like it's pressing down on you, and the work on the house slowed to a crawl. Contractors stopped showing up. The dumpster out front sat half-filled for a week before someone hauled it away. My mother still clung to her optimism, telling everyone in town about the grand opening they were planning for Labor Day, but I'd already seen the cracks form in. Danny was borrowing tools from neighbors again, making vague excuses about delays with the funding, and that private loan he'd bragged about back in April? It came due for its first balloon payment in mid-July. I knew because I'd looked up the public record, and I knew because he hadn't the faintest idea that the ground he was building on, both literal and financial, was about to be yanked out from under him. The noose was tightening, and I was the one holding the rope. The 4th of July parade rolled through town, the same as always. Fire trucks with their sirens, kids on bikes with streamers, the high school marching band sweating through their uniforms. But I noticed that for the first time in years, Danny didn't ride in the back of Dad's truck tossing candy to the crowd. He was at the house, hammer in hand, trying to beat the clock. I stopped by unannounced on the 10th, carrying a six-pack under one arm, and found him sitting on the porch steps, sweat dripping down his temples, his phone buzzing every few minutes with calls he didn't answer. "Rough day?" I asked, and he shot me a look that was equal parts pride and panic. "Just busy," he muttered, and I knew then that he was starting to feel the walls close in. That night, I drove past again and saw him in the upstairs window, pacing with the lights on, the kind of pacing you do when you're rehearsing bad news for someone. The endgame was in sight, and all I had to do was wait for the right moment to pull the last thread. That moment was coming faster than he realized. The first hard crack in Danny's carefully staged performance came on a Wednesday in late July, the air outside thick enough to chew, and the cicadas screaming so loud it felt like the whole world was vibrating. I was at the Shell station on Main, filling up my truck when I saw him pull in across the lot, cell phone plastered to his ear, one hand gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. He didn't see me, which was fine. I preferred it that way. And I watched from the pump as he sat there for a moment after hanging up, staring at the dash like it had just delivered a death sentence. That was the day the balloon payment came due, the one he'd sworn he'd have covered by early bookings and local investor interest, and I knew he hadn't booked a single paying guest or secured any investor who wasn't already sick of waiting. By the time he drove off, I'd already decided when to open the locked drawer in my mind. It wasn't going to be in some lawyer's office behind closed doors. It was going to be in public, the way they'd done me at the Waffle House, and if I played it right, the timing would make sure the entire town was watching. I bided my time through August, letting the heat and the debt bake him from the inside out, and I could see the change in him. The way he avoided eye contact at Murphy's Grocery, the way his once daily Facebook updates trickled down to nothing, the way my mother's voice grew tighter when she mentioned little delays in the renovation. The grand opening they'd been planning for Labor Day became a soft opening, then a by-invitation-only gathering, and finally, as I knew it would, an informal family barbecue, meant to celebrate progress. That barbecue was my moment. The morning of the barbecue broke warm and bright, the kind of late summer Ohio day where the sky is an endless blue and the smell of charcoal carries from yard to yard. I drove over around 3 with a cooler under my arm, dressed in jeans and an old Reds cap, just another brother stopping by to eat burgers and keep the peace. The front yard still looked like a construction site. Piles of lumber stacked against the porch, a half-installed railing, and tools scattered like the workers had walked off mid-shift. But my mother stood there in her floral apron greeting guests like she was hosting the governor. Neighbors had come, a few cousins, even Pastor Reynolds from First Baptist, all milling around with paper plates and solo cups. And I made my way through the crowd with handshakes and smiles, soaking in the curious glances. When the grill was sizzling and the iced tea was flowing, Danny decided it was time to make a little speech. He stood on the porch, burger spatula in hand, and started thanking everyone for believing in the dream and helping us get this far, painting himself as the man holding the family legacy together. My parents stood beside him, nodding, my mother's arm hooked through his like he was the prodigal son come home. That was my cue. I stepped forward, clapping slowly, smiling like I meant it, and when the chatter died down enough for my voice to carry, I said, "Danny, Mom, Dad, I think it's time everyone here heard a little more about this place, about the land it's built on." A ripple went through the crowd, the kind that comes when small-town folks smell a story, and I could see my mother's smile falter. "Michael, this isn't the time," she began, but I held up a hand. "See, a lot of people think owning a house means you own the ground under it," I said, my tone light, almost conversational. "But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes that land belongs to someone else entirely." I reached into my cooler and pulled out a manila envelope, fat with copies of the trust documents and county records, and I handed it to Pastor Reynolds, because in Franklin, nothing becomes public faster than something you put in a pastor's hands. "This here says that since 2011, the lot at 112 Sycamore Street, all the dirt, the foundation, the legal footprint, has been owned by a private trust. My trust. Which means I've been the landlord this whole time." A few gasps, a low whistle from someone in the back, and Danny's face drained like someone had pulled a plug. "You're lying," he said, but it came out thin, brittle. "No," I said softly. "I'm just cashing in on something I've been holding on to for a long time. You see, you can renovate a house all you want, but if you don't own the ground under it, you're just building on borrowed earth. And when the owner of that earth decides he's done lending, well..." I let the silence finish the sentence for me. I could see the calculation flicker across his face, the realization that his loan, his half-finished renovations, his plans for a bed and breakfast, all of it was now balanced on land he couldn't claim. My mother tried to step in, her voice trembling between anger and desperation, but I didn't let her. "You made your choice," I said, keeping my eyes on her. "You decided what loyalty was worth to you. Now I've decided what mine is worth to me." I turned to the crowd, to the people who'd watched me mow that lawn, fix that roof, pay those taxes for decades, and I said, "Effective immediately, all work on this property stops. The trust is terminating access. And in 60 days, unless the land is purchased outright, at full market value, the house will be removed." It landed like a thunderclap. People shifted uncomfortably, some looking at Danny, some at me, but no one spoke. I could feel the heat of the moment, the way it seared into memory, the way it would be told and retold over coffee at the diner for years. Then I reached into the cooler one more time and pulled out the chipped blue ceramic dish, holding it up for everyone to see. "This belonged to Grandma," I said, my voice steady. "It's the only real legacy worth keeping. She used it to make something worth sharing, worth passing on. I'm taking it with me because it's the only part of this family that hasn't been cheapened." And with that, I set it gently back in the cooler, closed the lid, and walked down the steps, past the stunned faces, past my father's averted gaze, past Danny standing frozen in the wreckage of his imagined empire. I didn't look back. The cicadas were still screaming, the sun still blazing, but the air felt lighter as I reached my truck and slid behind the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the porch. My mother's hand on Danny's arm, his head bowed, the neighbors already drifting away in clusters, their voices low. By the time I hit Route 42, I knew the story had already begun its journey through town, and I knew how it would end, with them choking on the very ground they'd taken for granted, and me miles away, baking a peach cobbler in a chipped blue dish, the smell of sugar and fruit filling a kitchen they would never step foot in again. Justice, served warm. If you enjoyed this story, please give a thumbs up to the video and consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful true life stories.